Shana Tova. My name is Rabbi Dan Ain, and as Reb Brenner noted, Jeremiah and I started these services a good dozen years ago, and it is really special to be here. It has been a few years since I have been in this space, and I just got back from a midlife crisis, so it's really great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you this morning. Thank you to Reb Brenner in particular. This is a rare opportunity, and I really appreciate it. I appreciate being able to speak to all of you on this holy morning. Now, I've preached in many different settings as a rabbi over the past 2 decades, and I have to say this is the most memorable of all of those spaces. I feel it's in this space, maybe it's because of the music, because of the people who come to Brooklyn Bowl, that people are listening just a little bit more intently. And so today for Rosh Hashanah, I am here, and next week for Yom Kippur, I will be in Schulenburg, Texas. I didn't make up that name. Schulenburg, Texas. Schulenburg is about 90 miles from Austin, Texas, which is where my wife and my 2 children moved last year. And it's where we are planting our new project called Moontower Minyan, with the goal of bringing programs a lot like this to Central Texas. And as I was talking to the president of the synagogue in Schulenburg, I asked her, is there anything I need to know when leading the service for your community? And she said, just one thing. There's only one thing you need to know, which is that as a rabbi, I need to be cool praying with gays and rednecks together. So I said to her, well, thankfully, I moved to Texas expressly for the purpose of praying together with gays and rednecks. Now, I always thought that my job in a venue like this was to try as best as I could to keep up with the band, to keep up with Jeremiah's constantly evolving repertoire of influences and arrangements, to say nothing about the amazing musicians and artists that we are all blessed to hear from this morning. Look, I knew I was never going to be as good at my job as they are at theirs, but I could try. I could try to share the soft prayers of our tradition that provide solace and comfort, and just to aggressively also hit those disquieting notes that are all over our service this morning. To not self-sell those either, because nobody wants to hear a horn half blown. Recently, I was teaching a group of 20-somethings about the central text from the High Holidays, and they hated every single one of them. They complained, they said, they let me know their anger over these old, antiquated, anachronistic, patriarchal, you get the idea, texts that we hear from this morning. These liturgical pieces, like the selection of Torah we just heard, or the who shall live and who shall die, they've always been too loud for some, too triggering for the sensitive. And I think in the last few years, they've become too loud for just about all of us. In fact, the most frequent question that I get these days is, Rabbi, how can I get someone to apologize to me? I tell them not to hold their breath. Take your son, the one that you love, your favorite, the one who will carry on your name, bind him at an altar, and sacrifice him to me, your God. That's the story that we just heard, that we read on Rosh Hashanah. This is the father figure that we Jews are given, the one who is willing to take us up to a mountain, say nothing to us on the way, and offer us up to his God. This is very upsetting material. And few remain fans of Abraham after this. Kierkegaard, who you may be familiar with, calls Abraham the father of faith because nobody can make any ethical sense of what Abraham is doing here. He says the point of the story is to see how great a thing that Abraham did in order that man may judge for himself whether he has the call and the courage to be subjected to such a test. In other words, our tradition has us hear this story at the beginning of the new year because it wants to unsettle and disturb us. And it wants us to ask the really hard questions about the sacrifices that we have made this past year for our children and the ones that we've made at their expense. Okay, so Rosh Hashanah, you should know, however, is not the time for doing teshuvah. This was explained by the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik. He says that's why we don't beat our chests, right? That's why we don't do a confessional. He said Rosh Hashanah is the day to awaken in us the need for doing teshuvah. Because if we don't feel that need to be real with ourselves and who we are and who we've become, then we really run the risk of just going through the motions for these next 10 days and maybe for the next year as well. But the Rav said it is almost impossible to preach about how to awaken teshuvah because it's going to be uniquely different for every one of you. What I say up here is going to hit each of you in a different fashion. And so he shared a personal story of his own from one night in Passover from 1967. And here's what he said. He said he awoke in the middle of the night from a fitful sleep, and there was a thunderstorm raging outside. And the wind and the rain was blowing angrily through the window of his room. Half asleep, he said, I quickly jumped up, got to my feet, closed the window. He said, I then thought to myself that my wife is sleeping downstairs in the sunroom. And I remembered the window was left open there as well. She could catch pneumonia, which in her weakened physical condition would be devastating. So he says, I ran downstairs, rushed into her room, slammed the window shut, and then turned around to see whether she had awoken from all of the noise or if she was still sleeping. He says, I found the room empty, the couch where she was sleeping neatly covered. In reality, she had passed away the previous month. Every Jew is obligated to sustain similar emotions on Rosh Hashanah, the Rav taught. The required response to hearing the shofar is the abrupt, tragic realization that the false assumptions upon which we have built our lives have come crashing down before our eyes. And so it's with that spirit and intention that I will share with you my personal story this morning. 5 years ago, I was called to leave Brooklyn and all of you and to take up a pulpit in San Francisco, and I thought this was the fulfillment of my career. Now, when I was ordained as a rabbi 15 years ago, I held up an iPhone at the Jewish Theological Seminary on 122nd and Broadway, and I said, this will be our main competitor for the hearts and minds of the Jewish people. And I published an article that year in a journal called Conservative Judaism. And I asked the question, if we believe that we are able to upload our consciousness into the cloud and live forever, then what use do we have for God? People thought I was nuts. But this was my battle. It was my cause against the dehumanizing impact of new technologies and the impact that they have on the lives of our children. And to be a rabbi in the Bay Area, I thought, would give me a front row seat to all of this change and provide a platform to argue for the ineffable and completely unique nature of each and every human being that can never be accounted for by a digit. I lost that battle. I mean, like, pretty handily. Now, at first, things went well. We bought a home, we saw the bridge, lifted up on a chair, celebrated in the community. But then came the pandemic, and the very traits that had previously made me an interesting and beloved rabbi were now the same ones that were isolating me and my family from just about everyone. If you've come here, you know that my ministry was about upending expectations by gathering people in small and sometimes large spaces and asking real, honest, and sometimes triggering questions. But now nobody wanted to hear them. And in California, synagogues and churches were considered non-essential, but liquor stores and weed shops remained open. I know, I made sure to check personally. I think we all know from stories of our own experiences that as human beings, we have the great capacity to care for each other. But with all of our technological fixes and progress, many of us have forgotten, or many of us haven't had the opportunity to benefit from common sense ways of living and supporting each other. After about 18 months of lockdowns, I wrote a piece and I mentioned that I noticed a phrase in the book of Ecclesiastes that I had never previously paid any attention to. It says, to everything there is a season, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. I said, many of us could never have imagined a world in which there would be a time to refrain from embracing, but yet that's what we've just been through. And I said, now the season has changed. After a year and a half of isolation, it is time to embrace. And after it was published, I got a phone call from a very nice gentleman who noted that he was speaking for himself and others, and he informed me, no, Rabbi, it is not time to embrace. You know, there's an old saying, if 100% of your congregation loves you, you're not being a rabbi. And if 100% of your congregation hates you, you're not a mensch. I learned that I was not much of a mensch. We and my kids found ourselves as outcast, disinvited to play dates and bar mitzvahs. And we sat down on the floor as a family and we cried. And we decided it was time to leave. We were invited to visit Austin by a lovely couple that had come to Rosh Hashanah. They'd even saved the prayer packet, and they welcomed my family in, and they told us how much all of this is needed there. And they said we reminded them of the Jewish refusnik families that they had helped emigrate from Russia. So we decided to stay. My wife said to me, all you have to do is not die. She took the kids to school, and I did the dishes. And I stayed away from pretty much all interpersonal interactions. And on those rare occasions that I would pick my son up from second grade, the teacher was always a little suspicious to hand him over into my custody. And I watched Jacques Pepin videos, and I got a lot of pleasure out of peeling and cutting vegetables. And when the kids got home from school, I had food waiting for them, and I enjoyed playing the role of afternoon VJ, curating music videos for them on YouTube. And our family became a magnet for some folks for whom our story was very validating of their worldview, while others assured us that ours was just an extreme situation and not connected to any worldview. I have no idea where I currently fall on the political spectrum, but our kids are happy. Recently, Samson, my 9-year-old son, has become interested in philosophy videos, like cartoons of Plato's allegory of the cave with scruffy-looking characters in chains staring at shadows on the wall, or the problem of other minds, like, how can I know what I see as green, you also see as green? Maybe what you see as green is actually red, but you call it green, and that problem is not solvable. At the moment, he prefers these to Peter, born in John, but that could change. His current favorite is the trolley problem, which he saw on The Good Place. The trolley problem is where you have a runaway train, and it's about to slam into 10 people, but you're able to control the switch. And you can, at the last minute, have it go in a different direction so that it only hits a single person. And Samson is hung up on this. He just wants to see it over and over again, and he wants to know what's the right decision. Do you hit the switch so it only hits the one person, or do you let it go on its way to hit the more people? I told him, I don't know. I said, but Jewish thinking is different. We believe that to save one life is as if you have saved an entire universe. And a universe has infinite value. I said to him, what's infinity plus infinity? We don't add people up. We don't turn them into numbers or digits. We don't sacrifice some for some others. We don't throw virgins into a volcano. And we don't bind our sons on mountaintops for our causes, no matter how righteous they may be. Our sages asked, why 2 calls from heaven? Why does the angel call down a second time to Abraham? Wasn't 1 call enough? Here's the answer that they give. They says, because Abraham refused to listen the first time. In fact, there's a legend that suggests that Abraham went through with it. He did exactly as God had commanded, and when he arrived at the top of that mountaintop, he sacrificed his son Isaac. But that Isaac was then resurrected, brought back to life by the tears of the ministering angels. And the sages said, if not for that second call, Abraham would have done it again. But when he hears the second call from the heavens, he puts down his knife and he comes to the tragic realization that the false assumption upon which he had undertaken his mission has come crashing down before his eyes. When that happens, what does he want? What does Abraham want? Well, we just heard. He wants God to notice. We know this because Abraham takes that spot and he names it Adonai Yireh, which translates as God, take note. As if to say, take note, God, and Kierkegaard, and all of you, that if not for that angel, I would have done it. I had every intention of completing this commandment had the angel not prevented me from doing so. So I called up my best friend, the screenwriter, to whine and feel sorry for myself. And he told me that what I was going through was called a false defeat in movie script terms. I said, it feels pretty real to me. He said, that is the way that it should feel for the character. He should feel that all is lost. A false defeat, he explained, is when the hero learns that the goal will not be achieved on the current path. And it's unlikely that it'll ever be achieved at all. He said, think about Rocky getting crushed by Clubber Lang and losing to Mickey. Or Oskar Schindler's workers being sent to the camps. In your case, it was the pandemic, he explained, but all is not lost. The path you were on wasn't the path for you to achieve your goal. If anything, he said, it was an opportunity for you to learn that some things about yourself that you have not learned until now. Like Rocky training with Apollo, or Schindler making his list. It helps to have a good friend. His frame allowed me to think a little bit bigger about my story, to return to first principles, to remember who I am and where I came from and what my purpose is. And so I went back to my notes from our very first Rosh Hashanah. And if you were here, you might remember what I spoke about. I talked about the need to put skin in the game of your life, to choose life. But choosing life can be painful, I said. It means working through your triggers. It means admitting that you've been wrong and doing something about it. And it means even losing some of those loved ones who just do not agree with the path that you're on. So, if we have suffered defeats during this past year, if we have lost friends, if we feel that we are owed an apology and want God to notice, if the false assumptions that we have built our lives on have come crashing down, what next? What will it be for us this year? Now, the great Rabbi Harold Kushner passed away during this past year. Rabbi Kushner wrote the book that is probably the best-selling book ever written by a rabbi, and it's called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And in thinking about what will it be for us this next year, I want to close with a couple of questions that he leaves with us this morning. In the final analysis, Rabbi Kushner of blessed memory wrote, "The question of why bad things happen to good people translates itself into very different questions. No longer asking why something happened, but asking how we will respond and what we intend to do now that it has happened. Are you capable of forgiving and accepting in love a world that has disappointed you by not being perfect? A world in which there is so much unfairness and cruelty. Are you capable of forgiving and loving the people around you, even if they have hurt you and let you down? And lastly, if you can do these things, will all of us, be able to recognize that the ability to forgive and the ability to love are the tools that God has given us to enable us to live fully, bravely, and meaningfully in a less than perfect world? And let us all say, Amen.